So we're here, remind us, we examined in the Beit Yosef, we saw the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, who held that dio, if it is mixed with tsim, with gallnut, it loses the identity as dio. It's no longer considered to be dio, and therefore it is pasul for writing tefillin, Sifrei Torah, and mezuzot. We saw, by contrast, we saw the Rosh and the Rambam, who explicitly say that one can make a dio and add afatzim later on, which is the way the Rambam says that he wrote. He made dio, which was hard sticks of ink, sort of like Chinese ink, I guess, which he would then shave off and soak them in a solution of gallnut, of afatzim. And the Rosh also held that this was okay. And what we saw is that even though dio, it seems like all of the Rishonim that we looked at, the Rambam, the Rosh, the Tam, and others, they all assume that dio is essentially what the Rambam describes, which is to take the pitch or the smoky remains when you burn something and you capture carbon by putting a plate on top, and then you mix that with some other things. The Rambam says you mix it with some gum arabic and with some honey, and then you make it into, you let it dry out. That is, everybody holds that that's dio proper. The only question is, if you can, is that the only thing that is kosher for writing stam? So according to Rebbeinu Tam, essentially yes, that's the only thing that's really kosher. According to the Rambam and most other Rishonim, dio really what the significance of the Mishnah pointing out that we write with dio is to exclude other colors. It's to exclude other kinds of pigments. So even if it's not that dio, but it's, let's say, an ink that is comprised of the gallnut solution that you boil up with the kankantum, which is the copper sulfate, and then that becomes a black ink, that's completely acceptable. And the Rambam states this here. He states it in the tshuva that I sent you a few weeks ago. I don't think we're going to look at the tshuva inside, but you're all encouraged to look at it yourselves. It's just interesting to look at it. Basically,
just a quick question.
Yes.
So, who you mentioned at the beginning of class, who says that mixing with gallnuts is not kosher dio anymore? That was Rabbeinu Tam, who seems to be an outlier.
Rabbeinu Tam.
Okay, and can you say one more time what copper sulfate is in Hebrew?
So in the copper sulfate, that's the kankantum.
Oh, there, I see it. Okay, thank
you.
Right.
So the kankantum is either it's a sulfate. It's either copper sulfate or iron sulfate. It's also known as vitriol. You can even look that up in the Wikipedia, vitriol, and it'll show you actually a whole list of things that were traditionally called vitriol. And in the language that was used by a number of the Rishonim, they call it vitriol or vitriolo. And yeah, the liquid ink that most sofrim use nowadays is essentially this ink of me'aftzah and kankantum. It's mainly the gallnut solution that's boiled together with a copper sulfate or an iron sulfate with some gum arabic added to it. That's the basic recipe, and I think I mentioned it becomes black as when a chemical reaction takes place between the afatzim, which is going to be naturally a dark brown, and the kankantum, which actually looks either greenish or bluish, but then when you boil it up together with the afatzim, it turns black. So all of this to say that the most Rishonim held that dio if you have a pigment that is black, that will be kosher for writing. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's how most Rishonim held basically. And so one of the sources that we saw in the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, it said, if you wrote the Azkarot, if you wrote the names of God in gold, then Yiganez, Ketav et Azkarot b'zahav Yiganez. So here, this part I think we looked at, but we'll pick up from here. זה כדברי הרמב"ם בראש, וכן נהגו העולם לכתוב ספרים, תפילין ומזוזות, במי הפצה וקנקנטון. Right, so this is the practice of most people, that they write stam, sfarim, tefillin, mezuzot, with the walnut juice mixed with the vitriol, with the kankantun. But now he points out something. Mitoch divrei harambam lamannu. So based on the words of the Rambam, we learn the Haditanya, that Braita that we learned in Masechet Shabbat, Katav et ha'azkarot b'zahav yiganez. If he wrote the Shemot Hashem in gold, that must be hidden away. In other words, that's pasul, and you're not allowed to use it. So, lav dafka azkarot. It's not necessarily only azkarot. It's not only that if you wrote the Shemot Hashem in gold, even if you wrote one letter from any of the other words that weren't Shem Hashem, if you wrote them in gold, it would also be pasul, right? The Rambam that we saw the last time, the Rambam actually doesn't single out Shemot Hashem. He just says that if you write anything in stam with any other pigment or with gold, it's pasul. So that's what we can learn out from the Rambam. The Azkarot, it's avdafk. It's not only if you write the Shemot Hashem in gold, if you write anything in gold, it's going to be pasul. Of course, that raises the question then, why did the Braita single out Shemot Hashem? So this is what we're going to discuss at the beginning here. V'chein katav Rabbeinu Yerucham b'Netiv Bet, Chelek Bet. The Rabbeinu Yerucham also says that the same thing, the same way as the Rambam, that if you write any letter in gold or any other pigment, it's pasul. So this is really where we're picking up from. The Nireh Dahadiktani Azkarot. So it seems that the reason that the Braita learned about Azkarot, about Shemot Hashem, that you can't write them in gold, Mishum Dahu Dahava Salka Da'atach, it would go up in our mind, which we might think, Mishum Dechashive, because they are important, right? There's a special importance attached to Shem Hashem. Adif Lekatvam B'Zahav Mibidyo. You might have thought that even though everything else I have to write in Dio, but you want to make these extra beautiful, and the Shem Hashem is extra special, so you might think, okay, but with the Shem Hashem, I could write that in gold.
That makes sense, because when I'm writing ketubot, a lot of times couples ask that their names be in gold, and for ketubot, it obviously doesn't matter, but the impulse makes sense. Yes,
right. It's that idea, right? And we know, in fact, as a matter of fact, that you look at old illuminated manuscripts, and it was pretty common for the first word to be illuminated, or also sometimes particular words get illuminated. So people might have thought that this is true. I'm going to put a sidebar here. You may know that in a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Kitvei Yam HaMelach, that the Shem Hashem in many of the manuscripts was written in the old Hebrew script, and the rest of the manuscript would be written in Ktav Ashuri, in the Assyrian script, but the Shem Havaya, Yud He Vav He, was often written in the old Hebrew script. Eventually, in our studies, at some point when we study the lettering more, we'll discuss that. It's an interesting phenomenon, and there are different theories about why they did it. But the reason I mention here, obviously, is because whoever was writing those manuscripts wanted to offset the Shem Hashem from the rest of the text. So here also, so this is one reason that this is a reason that the Beit Yosef says, maybe this is the reason that the Braita singles out Azkarot for being, that you shouldn't write them in gold, because you might think that you could write them in gold to make them extra special. Kamash Malan, but the Braita comes to teach us the Kol Shelo Katvan B'Dio Pasul. It teaches us that anything that was not written in Dio, even the Shemot Hashem, it's Pasul. The Kol Sheken L'Sharotiot, and all the more so if you wrote any other letters in gold, they would certainly be Pasul. Now he's going to give a slightly alternative understanding of this based on this reading from the Nimukei Yosef. So the Katuv b'Nimukei Yosef, Hilchot Sefer Torah, Dibur Matchil Stuma. So the Nimukei Yosef, I think I mentioned before, was one of the Rishonim who wrote a commentary and like an expansive commentary around the Rif. And you will find the Nimukei Yosef printed in the back of the standard Vilna Shas, of standard Gemara, around the Rif. Not on every Masachet, but on the Halachot Ktanot that the Rif wrote on Hilchot Sefer Torah, Tfilin, and Mezuzot, you will find the Nimukei Yosef. So the Nimukei Yosef wrote as follows: Katav et Azkarot b'Zahav, right? So he's quoting here what the Rif brings down this Braita, and the Braita said, if you wrote the Azkarot in gold, that it's Pasul. So the Nimukei Yosef comments, Klomar, that is to say, Shezarak Zahav al Katav Hashemot, Shenichtavu B'Dio, Afilu Hachi Pasul. So he says, so what happened here? He says this means to say that he threw gold onto the Shemot Hashem that were written in Dio. Nonetheless, it's Pasul. So the way he understands it is not that he wrote the letters to begin with in gold, but first he wrote them in with Dio, and then he threw probably some kind of a gold powder on top. So you know that traditionally in manuscripts they would do gold leaf, but there's also gold powder. Actually, I used to own some gold powder for just this purpose. And you could imagine that if you wrote out something using wet Dio before it dries, if you would sprinkle it with a layer of gold dust, it would stick, and you would have a beautiful golden letter. So he says that's what the Braita is talking about. Somebody threw gold onto Dio.
I use a similar technique, but I wait until after it's dry, and then I use an oil-based gold ink on top of the black. I mean, you can still see a border of black, but I definitely accent it on top of the black.
Right. Well, also look, when you're using real gold leaf, you put down the size, and you have to let it dry, but it's not completely dry. It's a little bit tacky, and then you have to burnish it on, and you know the drill. It's like a whole thing. But I will tell you, actually, years ago, I haven't found this now in a long time, but I don't do so much illumination anymore. I got what was called a gold button, which was pulverized gold that was in some kind of a medium, and you could paint it on with a brush, but it was real gold. It's not like the gold ink, which is really brass. The fake gold ink is really brass, but it was real gold, and it was quite beautiful. In any event, so the Nimukei Yosef says that this is what's going on. He had Dio, he threw some gold on it, and that's what the Braita means when it says it's Pasul. And why is it Pasul? He's going to explain. The Samech Lamed, the Svirale, because the person who wrote the Braita holds, he thought, K'tav ha'Alyon, K'tav, u'mevatel ha'Tachton, that the writing that was on top is the writing, and it voids what comes underneath. Ad kan l'shono, right? That's the end of his quote. So now, before I go into the comments of the Beit Yosef, this is why I gave you the sheet in Gittin. We're going to digress for a moment to understand this idea of Ketv Elyon and Ketv Tachton. So let me just bring that up here on my screen. We're looking at the sheet from Masechet Gittin, Daf Yutet Amud Aleph. Now we did the beginning of this sugya, and at the time I decided to put off doing the rest, but I think it's worth now taking a look at most of the rest of this sugya. So just to remind us about the parts that we did. At the top we have B'chol Kotvim, we write with everything. Vidyo, B'sam, B'sikra, B'komos, B'kankantum, B'chol Davar Shehu Shel Kayama. So we write here we're talking about writing a get. And you can write a get with any of these things. You can write with Dio, with Sam, Sikra, Komos, Kankantum, anything that will last. And we looked here at the beginning of the Gemara. I'm going to skip this part. This is where the Gemara defines the terms that are in the Mishnah. And I think we even looked at this part, but I'll remind us of this part. So in the Mishnah, it gives us a list of all these things that one can write a get in, and then it gives us a general rule, anything that lasts. So the Gemara, of course, wants to know what does that tell me that I didn't already know? B'chol davar shehu mitkayem, that is slightly different here in the Gemara. Anything that lasts. Latuye mai, what does that come to include that I didn't already know? So the Gemara answers, Latuye haditani Rabbi Chanina, it comes to include that which Rabbi Chanina learned, that what? Ktavo b'mei tarya v'aftza kasher, if he wrote it with mei tarya or aftza, that the get is kosher. So we saw in Rashi, b'mei tarya, in the first iteration, says it means make shamim, it's rainwater, and in his, that's what he learned from his teachers. And then the other perush he gives is mei tarya is mayim prishu ke'ein afatzim, galus be'la'az. That mei tarya is a solution of water with some kind of fruit that is like afatzim. So, according to the second page of Rashi, these two things are two different things. There's mei tarya and aftza, which would be mei afatzim. That if you wrote a get either with mei tarya, which is this solution with some kind of fruit in it, or with the galnut solution, that the get is kosher. Okay. We also have this, Tani Rabbi Chia, Ketavo be'avar, be'shachor, u'be'shichur, kasher. Rabbi Chia adds that anything, this is a continuation of to answer the question that the Gemara just asked, what are other things that are mitkayem, that last, that you could write it with? So he gives three other things. If you write the get with avar, which is lead, Rashi explains it means sheshafa oferd b'mayim u'mashchirim, that if he rubbed the lead in water and then it darkened. In other words, he made a kind of a lead solution that he could use for writing. Or if he wrote bishachor, what is shachor? Rashi says it's pchamin, it's charcoal. Ubeshifur, Rashi says is charta de'ushchafi. It's the black that shoemakers wear to blacken their shoes. Those are another three things that you could write a get with or in. Okay, itmar. So now we're going to get closer to the topic I want to get to. Itmar hamavir dio al gabei sikra b'Shabbat. somebody who passes over with dio on top of sikra. Sikra, as you remember, is a reddish pigment. So what's the Gemara talking about? Somebody had already written before Shabbat in sikra, in this reddish pigment, and they even let it dry. And then on Shabbat, somebody takes a pen and he dips it in ink, and then he goes with the ink right over the letters that were written before Shabbat, but now he's doing this on Shabbat. So the question is that considered to be ktiva? Is that considered to be writing for the purpose of violating Shabbat? So Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish Damri Tarvayu. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Reish Lakish both hold, they both said, Chayav Shtayim. He's actually Chayav, he's obligated to 2 korbanot chatat, 2 punishments. Why 2? Achat mishum kotev, 1 because he wrote, because we consider the new ink that he put on top of the sikra to be ktiva for the purpose of Shabbat. And achat mishum mochek, and also he's also over because when he wrote the upper letters, the top letters with the ink, he was at the same time erasing the bottom letters that were written in Sikra. So just to point out, in case you don't know, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were colleagues. Reish Lakish was a Talmid Chaver, right? He was a student colleague of Rabbi Yochanan. And in most of Shas, they disagree. So whenever they do agree, the Gemara, like it does here, goes out of its way to say, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish da'amrei tarvayu, that both of them say, right? And we'll see in a moment that this will nonetheless lead into a disagreement. So let's just take a quick look at Rashi. Dio al gabe sikra. Al gabe sikra, Rashi says, shtei otiot shel sikra. There were 2 letters of sikra. The reason we talk about 2 letters is because I think we may have mentioned this in a previous shiur. You're chayav for writing on Shabbat once you write 2 letters. That's the minimum you have to write to be chayav dioraita, right? To be chayav min haTorah on Shabbat for writing. So if you wrote agabe sikra, 2 letters of sikra were written, v'he'avir alehem dio b'Shabbat, and then he went over them with ink on Shabbat. So he's chayav twice, once for writing and once for erasing. And Rashi says, mochek al menat lichtov shtei otiyot b'Shabbat chayav. So when are you chayav for erasing on Shabbat? You're only chayav for erasing if you've erased something in order to write again, right? It has to have a positive action. If you're just erasing, then it's simply destructive. And that's patur, right? That's exempt from punishment from the Torah. It's asur mid'Rabbanan, but it's exempt from the Torah. But here, what he's doing by writing, he's writing and erasing at the same time. So clearly when he is erasing, that is, he's covering up the red letters, he is automatically erasing in order to write, right? That's exactly what he's doing. So Rashi explains this, mochek, he's erasing al menat lichtov shtei otiyot b'Shabbat chayav. If you're erasing in order to write 2 letters on Shabbat, you're chayav. V'zeh mochek atachtonot sikra v'ktav ha'elyonot dio, right? And here he is erasing the bottom letters, which is sikra, and he's leaving the upper letters, which are the dio. Okay, so this is our first instance in the Gemara where we're talking about, we have now a concept of K'tav Elyon and K'tav Tachton, right? So the K'tav Tachton in this instance was the Sikra, and the K'tav Elyon is the Dio. So what we see is that in this case, the K'tav Elyon is considered to be K'tiva, has the deen of writing, as far as Shabbat goes. So now Gemara goes into another question. So that we've established that if that Ktav Elyon on a Ktav Tachton on Shabbat is considered to be Ktav, and you're chayav for writing, and also you're chayav for erasing. Now we have the next case, Dio al gabe Dio, Sikra al gabe Sikra, Patur. So let's take two other cases. What if you had two letters that were written before Shabbat in Dio, and then on Shabbat you took a kulmus and you dipped it in Dio, and then you wrote right over it with new Dio? Or you had two letters that were written in the Sikra, and then on Shabbat you took a pen and you wrote with Sikra on top of the Sikra that you wrote before Shabbat. In both of those instances, you're patur. You are exempt from punishment on Shabbat. Rashi explains patur shaharehu batchila lo katav v'lo machak, because we see here to begin with, he's neither writing. In other words, what he's writing now is nothing new. He hasn't changed anything from the status that it had already before Shabbat, because the Dio is sitting on Dio, the Sikra is sitting on Sikra. So the original Dio was not obliterated, the original Sikra was not obliterated, and nothing essentially new was done. Again, this is Asur midirabanan, but midiraita, this is not considered to be writing. So now let's go the other way. Sikra al gabe Dio. What if you had two letters that were written in ink before Shabbat, and then you take a red pigment, the Sikra, and you write on top of the Dio on Shabbat with the Sikra? Amrila chayav. Some people say if you write with the Sikra on top of Dio on Shabbat, that you're chayav, that is considered to be ktiva, or we'll see in a moment, you're chayav. We'll see why you're chayav. Amrila patur, and some people say that you're exempt. So now the Gemara explains, Amrila chayav, those who say that you're chayav for putting the Sikra on top of the Dio, you're not chayav because you wrote, you're chayav because you're mocheku. Rashi explains, mocheku v'lo kotev, you're not writing, shemitchila haya katuv hagun me'ata, right? To begin with, it was written properly, and now when you wrote the Sikra on top of it, you have obliterated the ink, the Ktav Tachton. So you're mochek. Amila patur, some people say that the people who say that you're patur if you write with Sikra on top of Dio, why are you exempt? Mekalkelhu, because you're ruining it. Mekalkelhu, Rashi says, v'havale kimochek almanat shelo lichtov. You just ruin the bottom letters when you write with the Sikra on top, and it's like you're erasing them not with the intention of writing, right? You're just ruining the bottom letters. The person who says that you're chayav for doing this, he says, because you don't really ruin it so much, shaharek tavonikar, because you still be able to recognize the letters after you go over them with Sikra. Okay, so just to recap, so we have, as far as Shabbat goes, these are the instances that we talked about. If you wrote with Dio, with black ink on top of red ink that was already written before Shabbat, that's considered to be ktiva, and the Ktav Elyon will be considered to be ktiva. If you write with Dio on top of Dio, or a Sikra on top of Sikra, then effectively you haven't changed the status of anything. So you're patur on Shabbat, that's not considered to be ktiva for Shabbat. And if you write with Sikra on top of Dio, then it's not ktiva, but you might be chayav because you have erased what's underneath, or you might be patur according to other opinions because you've just ruined what's underneath. Okay, so now this leads us up to the main question that we need to examine. Bai minei Resh Lakish me Rabbi Yochanan. So now, after this discussion, Resh Lakish asks Rabbi Yochanan, Eidim she'ein yodim lachtom, mahu sheyichtavu lahem b'sikra v'yachtemu. Says, let's take a different case, not on Shabbat. Let's take a case of a get. The sofer wrote out the get, and now in order for the get to be kosher, it has to have two witnesses who sign. So what if we have two illiterate witnesses, and we want them to sign? So what would happen, what would the halacha be if you have witnesses, edim she'ein yodim lachtom, ma'u sheyichtavu lahem b'sikra v'yachtemu? What would the din be if we wrote their names out on the get, but we wrote it in this red pigment, and then we gave them a pen to go over it with Dio? They just have to trace over the letters that we wrote. Right? So based on what we learned until now, where we talked about writing with Dio on top of Sikra, so what would you think the answer would be? If I had written out something with Sikra, and then I wrote on top of it with Dio, what would you think? Would that be considered to be Ktiva?
No.
No. I'm sorry?
I think no.
Why? What? Based on what we learned already, why would you say not?
I've lost track of the different of the different configurations, but it seems like if you're writing, well, if you write with Joe on top of the Sikra, then you're, well, I guess I was gonna say then you're machaking what's underneath by writing on top, but it's not. You're not going from nothing. You're doing the mechika. I've lost track of my point, but the point is you're not writing on top of nothing. You're writing on top of something.
Okay, so now what I'm going to, right, because it's a lot to keep in our heads, and that's why I'm trying to go, right. What we're going to do just before I go on the Gemara. So let's go back. This was the first example. Itmar hama'avir dio agabe sikra b'shabbat. Right? If you wrote with dio on top.
He's both writing and he's both writing and machaking.
Right. So he's both writing and he's both kotev and mochek at the same time. He's both writing and erasing at the same time.
So that would imply that yes, he is the illiterate witnesses are in fact writing.
So that would imply yes. So this seems to be that. So this is Reish Lakish. This is the question of Reish Lakish. As we'll see in a moment, he's going to spell this out. So we'll see it again. Ba'imine Reish Lakish me Rabbi Yochanan. By the way, when you learn Gemara, you may be familiar. This is a common phrase. Ba'amine. He asked of him, and it's a particular kind of question. Ba'aya, like modern Hebrew, in Hebrew, ba'aya means a problem. It's in Aramaic. It means to ask a question. In the context of the Gemara, it's to ask a two-sided question. It's specifically this kind of question that Reish Lakish is going to ask. Yeah, we have a question, and it's either going to be X or it's going to be Y. Edim she'ein yodim lachtom, witnesses who don't know how to sign. Mahu sheyichtavu lahem b'sikra v'yachtemu. So what would the din be to say that we write out their names in sikra, and then they sign by writing with the dio on top of what we wrote? K'tav Elyon k'tav, or eino k'tav. Do we say on the one side that the upper k'tav, the k'tav that's on top, which is the dio, that is considered to be writing, and therefore the get would be kosher? Or eino k'tav, or we don't consider the upper writing, the top layer of writing to be k'tav, and therefore the get would be pasul. So Rabbi Yochanan answers Reish Lakish, Amar le, Aleph Lamed Amar le, he said to him, Eino k'tav, it's not k'tav. This dio, the witnesses would write on top of the sikra, this will not be considered to be writing for the purpose of a get. So of course, Reish Lakish, now he jumps, he asks the obvious question. Amarle, v'haloli madtanu rabbeinu, k'tav elyon, k'tav li'inyan Shabbat. And didn't you teach us, Master, that the K'tav Elyon, the K'tav that was on top, the Yo al Gabe Sikra, was considered to be K'tav as far as Shabbat. So why not here also? Right? So he goes back to the very first thing that Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan discussed, and he asks the obvious question: how can you say over here on Shabbat that if he writes with Yo on top of Sikra, that's K'tav, and here you're going to say that it's not K'tav for the purpose of the get? So Rabbi Yochanan says to him, Amar Le, Rabbi Yochanan answers him, and because we speculate, or because we imagine, or we come, speculate as to the possibilities here, that we would actually do this in practice. All right, it's a rhetorical question, which we'll explain a little bit more with Rashi. But what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that just because the way we define k'tiva, l'chumra, right, we're being machmir in Shabbat when we say that the k'tav elyon is k'tav, that doesn't automatically mean that I will use that same principle in a different area of halacha, where maybe the conceptual reasons that I need to have k'tiva are different. In other words, the notion of k'tiva regarding get are not necessarily identical to the notions of k'tiva that I need to be chayav on Shabbat. And so, while I learned it l'chumra on Shabbat, that doesn't mean I will now learn it l'kula for get, right? Because if I say that the k'tav elyon is k'tav as far as a get goes, now it's a kula, right? Now it's a big heter for me to say that I can use the signature of the edim on top of the sikra to make the get kosher. Let's just take a look at the Rashi here. K'tav elyon, k'tav inyan Shabbat, right? That's over here.
That's a question.
Sure.
Can we, if we're trying to, we're not using any sikra in our modern times, and I'm wondering if we can use sikra as an analogy for pencil for today. Would that be a useful construct?
In principle, yes, and actually the Gemara a little bit later, it's going to bring an example from lead, which was used like a pencil.
So it's a separate category then? I'm sorry? So then pencil is a separate category than sikra?
I'm going to not, instead of answer, I'm going to wait. We'll get to it in a moment in the Gemara, and you'll see, like so many other things in halacha, it depends. It depends. So let's just fill this out here, though, with Rashi. K'tav elyon, k'tav inyan Shabbat, right? That the upper k'tav is the k'tav as far as Shabbat. Ahamart le'el chayav shtayim, right? This was the question, right, that the Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, that you said that the upper k'tav, the upper layer of k'tav, is considered to be k'tav as far as Shabbat. And Rabbi Yochanan answers Reish Lakish by saying, sha'anu midamin, sha'anu omdim uspurin va'omdim me'umad me'omed livno lahachmir. So just because we estimate or we surmise or because we're trying to draw this conclusions, or what we're trying to do, to use slightly different words, Rabbi Yochanan says, just because we would like to make this extrapolation, we would like to make this inference from Shabbat, to say, over there where we machmir, naaseh ma'aseh lahakel, now you think that we can extrapolate from what we learned in Shabbat to be machmir. Now you think we can extrapolate from that to get to be mekil. Afil inyan Shabbat in bama aser yadenu bisban Beit Hamikdash. Now Rashi adds in another layer of Rabbi Yochanan's thinking. So he says, because even as far as Shabbat, if an actual case came before us where somebody had written with dio on top of Sikra at the time when there was still a Beit HaMikdash, and in principle, if I knew for sure that he was chayav, I would tell him he needs to bring a korban chatat, he needs to bring a sin offering because he wrote on Shabbat. He says, even then, lo hayiti somech al dvarai lavi chulin la'azara. Even then, I wouldn't rely on my own psak, on my own words that I said that the K'tav Alyon is K'tav L'inyan Shabbat. I'm not so certain of that I would tell somebody who actually did this on Shabbat, who is in a position to bring a sin offering, I wouldn't tell him to bring a sin offering because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that K'tav Alyon is not K'tav. And if that's true, then the sin offering that he brings to the Beit HaMikdash isn't really a sin offering. It's chulin. It's not kodesh. It's just an animal that he slaughtered in the Beit HaMikdash. And of course, you're not allowed to bring chulin la'azara. You're not allowed to bring non-holy korbanot, non-holy animals that have not been set aside to be a korban. You can't bring them into the Beit HaMikdash and slaughter them and put on the Mizbeach. So according to Rashi, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is, I'm machmir about this as far as Shabbat goes. I'm not going to be makil about it as far as the get goes, because even on Shabbat, right now I'm machmir, but if I was in a position to make a psak about somebody who did this on Shabbat, who could bring a korban chatat, I'm not so sure I would tell him to bring the korban chatat, because maybe the K'tav Alyon isn't K'tav. And I think actually, Liana, I think this is going to where your mind was going a little bit earlier, because you could argue, you could say, even the dio al gabe sikra, you could argue that's not really k'tiva, because all he's doing is tracing over something that was already written. And even though he's changing the way it looks, because now it's, before it's red and now I'm making it black, but you could argue this is not a creative malacha. He's not actually creating something new. And you could see that this is how Rashi understands in Rabbi Yochanan's mind. He's not 100% sure. So he says that for practical halacha, bizman hazeh, in this day and age, I'm going to tell you, people are not allowed to write on Shabbat. They're not even allowed to take dio and go over Sikra on Shabbat. But bizman Beit HaMikdash, I'm not so sure. And as far as the get, for sure I'm not going to machshir a get. I'm not going to say a get is kosher if somebody wrote dio on top of Sikra. And Rashi translates bidamin into Old French. And of course, I don't know Old French, but you can see this word here. It's suspicier down here, which is the same root as we get for suspect, right? Kamo kemedumim, right? That we suspect or we imagine. So I like Old French words that sound familiar to me some way because I don't know French. Anyway, okay. Now we're going to get to this last part here, and then I think we'll just not have time to finish up what we started in the Beit Yosef, and I think after all this, I think you'll understand what the Nimukei Yosef was trying to say earlier. So now, Itmar, we have a Ma'amar Amoraim, and this is what they said, Edim she'en yodim lachtom. We're going to go into this a little bit further, because this is a practical issue. By the way, I want to tell you, I wrote Gittin for many years. I used to live in Boston. I wrote many, many Gittin. And it's actually very common nowadays that people don't know how, nowadays people are literate, but they don't necessarily know how to sign a get. It's a slightly different issue than what the Gemara is talking about. Those are people who really didn't know how to write, but it was sometimes when we needed a witness who had never signed on a get before. When you sign on a get, you don't use your regular signature. You have to write in a Ketav stam. You have to write in a basic Ketav stam. It can be stick figures. It doesn't have to look very beautiful, but you have to write it. So many, many times I would have to give on-the-spot lessons to people to how to write their name. And I would write their name out and just tell them to copy it. So back then, in the time of the Gemara, they had a similar issue, but there were people, again, who didn't know how to write at all. So this is the question. So now we have different etzot, right? We have different suggestions about how to get them to sign. Rav Amar, Mikarin lahem niyar chalak, u'memalim et hakra'im bidyo. So Rav says that we tear a flat sheet, a smooth sheet of paper, and then they fill in the tears with dio. So Rashi actually explains this makarim. He says it doesn't mean that you actually rip the paper. It means misartin. You scratch. In other words, you do a sirtut, right? You do an impression. You take some kind of a stylus and you make an impression of their names into the paper that you're writing the get on. And then they can just take a pen with ink and they can fill in the impression with dio or just go over it with dio. Other Rishonim say what it means is that you take a separate sheet of paper and you cut into it and essentially make a stencil. That, right, you rip into it or you cut into it, you make a stencil of their name, and then you put that on top of the sheet of paper that they're going to have to sign on the get, and they fill in the stencil with dio. But either way, all right, those are two possible alternatives to understanding Rav. So that's one way, right? People who don't know how to write, either you make an impression on the page and they can go over it, or you make them a stencil and they can fill in the stencil. Shmuel Amar be'avar. Shmuel says with lead. Right, so this is Liana's question. And Rashi says, we'll see it, we'll hold off in a second on Rashi. What does Shmuel mean by doing it with lead? So the Gemara right away asks, be'avar salkadata. You think that he could write it with lead? In other words, you can't write it with lead. That's for sure not good. In other words, what does he mean to write it with lead? He means that we write out the name of the witness in lead, and then he goes over it with dio. So the Gemara says, "Ba'avar salka da'atach." You think you could do that and write his name out in lead, and then he goes over it with dio? B'hatani Rabbi Chia, ktavo ba'avar b'shachur b'shichur kasher. Right? We learned earlier in the page that Rabbi Chia said over here, ktavo ba'avar b'shachur b'shichur kasher. If he writes it, in other words, if he writes the get with lead, then it's a kosher get. So what we know is that writing with lead is ktiva. And what we know from earlier on, if you write ktiva al gabe ktiva, you haven't done anything. You haven't accomplished anything. Because let's say as far as Shabbat went, we said ktav, if you wrote with dio on top of dio, you're patur on Shabbat. So here also, if avar is considered to be a kosher thing to write the get with, kosher substance to write the get with, then if you write over it, you haven't done anything, right? It's not going to be considered ktav. So Shmuel Amar ba'avar. Shmuel says you can do it. You can write the witness's name in lead. Morat asks, ba'avar salka da'atach. You think that he could write it with lead? B'hatani Rabbi Chia katavo ba'avar b'shachur b'shichur kasher. Right? And Rashi says V'kevan diktav gamurhu, since writing with avar, writing with lead, is complete ktav. In other words, it will be ktiva enough that I would say that the get is kosher. It's katav gamur. Havale kidyo agabe sikrag dikasrinim la'el. Then it's going to have the same din as taking dio on top of sikra, which is also ktav. So the Gemara answers for Shmuel. And the Gemara says, lo kasha. So this isn't a kasha, this isn't a problem. The kasha is a contradiction, right? So there's no contradiction. There's no contradiction between what Shmuel says to write with avar, to write with lead, and what Rabbi Chia said earlier, that you can write get with lead. Ha ba'avra, ha b'maya da'avra. This is talking about when he wrote with lead, in other words, just lead itself. And this is when he wrote with a solution of lead, right? Water, lead water, right? And Rashi explains, "Ba'avar l'shafshef b'chaticha shel avar al hakaf u'ma'iro eino ktav," right? So if you take lead and you rub it onto the page and you make dark forms with it, that's not ktiva. And that's what Shmuel is talking about. Shmuel says if you write with lead itself, you take a piece of lead and you write onto the paper that's on the get, that's not ktiva, and therefore you could write the witness's name in lead, and you could give them dio to go over it. Ha b'maya da'avra, ma'im sheshara behem shchitat avar. Shchikat avar, right? So it's water that ground lead was dissolved in or added into. That's considered to be, if you write with that, that's ktiva, right? Because we know that if you write with straight lead, it'll rub off. But if you write in a lead solution, it's going to soak in, and it will be a davar shel kayama. It'll be something that lasts. Let's just finish off the last part here. Rabbi Yavo mar b'mei milin. Rabbi Yavo says you can write their names out with mei milin. What's mei milin? Rashi says ma'im sheshara bahen afatzim shchukim. It's a solution of gallnuts. Right? It's a gallnut solution. It's ground gallnut that was dissolved in water. It's also called mei milin. So Rabbi Yovel says you could write their names in a gallnut solution, and then they could go over that with dio. So the Gemara also asks on this, V'hatani Rabbi Chanina. But Rabbi Chanina learned, Ktavo b'mei tarya v'aftza kasher. Rabbi Chanina said explicitly that if you write the get with mei tarya, right, which Rashi said is a solution that's like afatzim, or aftza, which is actually mei afatzim, it's actually a gallnut solution. If you write the get in gallnut solution, it's kosher. So again, we have the same problem. How can Rabbi Yuval say that you're allowed to write the witnesses' names in mei milin or / mei afatzim and have them go over it, because the mei afatzim that you're writing in is kosher as ktav. You're already doing the ktiva. So their ktav on top of that is not going to help. So the Gemara answers lo kasha. So it's not a question, it's not a contradiction. Ha da'afitz, ha lo afitz. Shein mei milin al gabei mei milin. So what does he mean? Ha da'afitz, Rashi explains, ha da'afitza haklafim ubadim ba'afatzim, roshmim aleihem et ha'edim b'mei milin. So he says, what Rabbi Aval was talking about is if you were writing on klaf that was worked with afatzim, it was worked with gallnut, in other words, it was tanned klaf. So then if you write with this gallnut solution on top of leather or klaf that was tanned with gall, that's not ktav. Because the lo havi ktav, sharei marei klafim kimarei aktav ve'ino nikar. right? Because when you write with the gallnut solution on top of a gallnut finished chaf, you can't see it. It's just going to fade into the background. It's the same color as the background. And so therefore, you could do it. So let's say, but it would be, even though it would be faint, it would be enough that you could do that and then have the witness take dio and go over it again. Hilkach, therefore, ein mei milin al gabe mei milin. That's what he means, that you, mei milin, you can't see a gallnut solution that's written on a surface that was worked with gall. Matnitin b'delo afitzan. And our Mishnah, right, or the bright of Matnita, the Breita of Rabbi Chanina says that if you write it with aftza, if you write a get with mei afatzim, it's kosher. He means if you write a get with mei afatzim on a surface that was not worked with afatzim. Okay, so this was a lot to pack in a short amount of time, but for our purposes, what we need to understand now at the end is we have this idea of writing and then writing on top of writing, right? So we have the Ketv Tachton and the Ketv Elyon. And what we've seen so far, if we were to make a quick summary in a very broad sense, we understand that we consider the Ketv Elyon, we consider that to be writing l'chumra, but not necessarily l'kula. In other words, if it's going to be a chumra to consider the upper writing, then we'll say it's writing, and the chumra, you're not allowed to do it, or it's pasul, or whatever the hashlachot are. And if it's l'kula, then we won't consider it to be ktiva. So now, in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to go back to the original screen, and then that's where I think now we can understand these few words now in Nimukei Yosef, I think will make a little more sense. So, Katuv b'Nimukei Yosef, Katavet azkarot b'zahav, right? The Breita and the Rif brings is that if you wrote the Shemot Hashem in a Sefer Torah, or in Tefillin, or in Mezuzah, wrote them in gold, that Yiganeh, have to hide that away because it's pasul. So he explains, Klomar, what does it mean? Shezarak Zahav, al Ktav HaShemot, he put gold onto the writing of the Shemot Hashem, Shenichtavu b'dio, that were already written in dio, Afilu Hachi pasul. Nonetheless, those Shemot, now that he's covered with gold, they're pasul. Why? Disirle, because he holds Ktav Ha'elyon Ktav, because the upper layer of writing is considered to be Ktav. And again, here it's going to be L'chumra. We'll consider it to be Ktav L'chumra, U'mevatel HaTachton, and it voids the Ktav that came underneath, which is the layer of Dio. Ad kan L'shono. Right, so that's the quote of the Nimukei Yosef. And the Beit Yosef explains, V'nirali dahainu dafka k'she'ino yachol laha'avir et hazahav. Now he's adding in another layer, pardon the pun. He says, I would say, would seem to me, this is only in an instance where you cannot remove the gold. Avim im yachol laha'aviro, but if you could remove the gold, Ya'avirenu, you should take it off. Yishaer k'tav tachton, and leave the bottom k'tav as it was. So, mihu, nonetheless, ba'askarot, yirad asur laha'aviro. But in the case of Shemot Hashem, that you put gold on top of, nirad asur laha'aviro. In that instance of Shem Hashem, it would seem to me that's forbidden to remove that gold. Yishum dahave kamocheket Hashem, because it would be like erasing God's name. And he's careful here to use the term kim mochek Hashem. It's like erasing God's name. you're not really erasing God's name because the Dio will still be there underneath. But this is a category in Mechikat Hashem, it's Kimochek Hashem, and it's also Asur. And according to what I'm explaining now, that's why the Braita used the example of Azkarot, of Shemot Hashem. It's about Azkarot. It says explicitly that those should be hidden away. De'ein lo takana, because it's impossible to fix that, because you're not allowed to remove the gold. Because removing the gold would be like erasing those shemot. Aval b'shar tevot, but regarding other words, teva here means words, regarding other words that are not Shem Hashem, eino tzarich liganez. He does not have to hide those away. He doesn't have to remove them. Dema'avir hazahav, he can remove the gold, the choser lekashruto, and then it will go back to its state of being kosher. This is the end of the discussion here on Dio. So just to make a very quick summary here. So what we said is, we discussed this Braita here that it said, Katavet azkarot b'zahav yiganez. If you wrote the Shemot Hashem in gold, that those have to be put into Geniza. And so we discussed basically two approaches to understanding these words. They don't contradict, but they take a slightly different stance. According to the Rambam doesn't talk about Azkarot at all. He just says that if you write any words in anything, in any pigment other than a black pigment that's like Dio, that it's pasul, right? That would include gold, right? He says explicitly other pigments, other colors, or with gold, it's pasul. So there's nothing special about the example of Azkarot. But based now on what I understood from the Nimukei Yosef's comment, that he says that we understand that you could remove the gold from any other word besides Shem Hashem. Now I understand the reason the Braita used the example of Katavet Azkarot specifically. It's not because if you wrote anything else in gold that it would be kosher. You can't write anything in gold. But there's an explicit problem. If you write the Azkarot with Shem Hashem, you can't fix it. So your only alternative is to put it into Geniza. So are there any questions? No, okay. So I know it's a lot to take in, but God willing, next time we'll continue down here, B'Ktivat Tama. I may send you some other material, but just so you know, we're going to look at this Gemara here in Menachot, Perek HaKometz Amud Daled Amud Aleph. We're actually going to go back and look a little bit at the sugya and Chavtet Amud Aleph, and so I may try to prepare those as separate sheets. And that's it for now. I wish you all a Chag Sameach and Gemar Chatima Tova, and thank you for joining me. And I'll be in touch next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shel. Bye.
Very much.
Bye.